Hey everyone, in this video I want to look at a new way to define and apply our conditional access for all the different applications we have. Because if I have thousands of applications, it can start to get very cumbersome to have a conditional access policy for every application or every group of applications. It's really hard to then go and update them. So let's take a step back. We have the idea that obviously we have our Azure Active Directory, that's our identity provider that speaks all of those things cloud. So we have our Azure AD that has all our users, our devices, our groups, but also we have all of the enterprise applications that are using this Azure AD for its authentication. Now, these applications, they could be first-party apps from Microsoft, like Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365, Azure. They can be third-party apps from the gallery or ones you define yourself using SAML or OAuth, whatever you want, that maybe aren't part of the gallery. They can be custom apps that you create. I create an app registration, and then, hey, I can use that for the authentication for my app. They can even be apps that are on-premise when I integrate them via technologies like App Proxy. Azure AD App Proxy has a little agent and does that communication for us. So for all of these applications, they become an enterprise app within our particular tenant. So it's a known quantity. And then if I think about, okay, the apps are in there, what we then want to do is have protection for them. So the way we layer on protection for everything here is we're going to use conditional access. So now we have this idea of conditional access. And this surrounds everything. So all of these different applications, all of the attempts to access will go through this. Now, within conditional access, there's a lot of different things I can do. For example, we have things now like authentication strength. Now, we're used to the idea of requiring MFA, but authentication strength goes a lot further. So if we actually jump over for a second and let's take a look at this. So if I was to go and jump over to the Entra portal, look at my auth methods and look at authentication strengths, we have the selection now available to us. Now there's ones that are built in, as we can see. So hey, I just require MFA, it could be anything. Then there's passwordless MFA, so things like Hello for Business, the Authenticator app, and then phishing resistant MFA, which just takes away the Authenticator app. So certificate-based Hello for Business, FIDO2 security keys. Or we can create our own. So I've got a custom one I created over here. And the only difference from my one is I also include the ability to use password and the Authenticator app. But I'm not going to allow things like text messages or voice or all of those other options that you may consider less secure. So we have authentication strengths that give me a lot of now power within my conditional access policy. And if we just go and look at a policy for a second, for example, let's look at this one. As part of the grant now, we see that ability to select, well, what authentication strength do you want? And we see the built-in ones and then ones that I've custom added myself. So I can have controls based on that. But there's many other things. There's all these different conditions. So you see things like user risk and sign-in risk. You see things like the device platform. As part of the device platform, I could make that part of the grant and require that device to be marked as compliant. I could make it required to be hybrid Azure AD joined. I could go and check on attributes of the device. So for example, if I go and look at my conditions here, I can actually go and say, well, does it have a certain attribute equal to a secure access workstation? So there's all these fantastic things that I can do as part of my conditional access policy. So authentication strength is one of them, but the risk, the user's overall risk based on all different interactions, and then the individual sign-in risk. All of this comes from identity protection. As I showed, there's things like the device state. And that device state can include, well, its health, the compliancy based on your MDM solution. So that could be Intune, but also attributes. Hey, it's a SAW, it's some specific machine. And the list goes on and on. So I've got all these different things that can drive conditional access. And again, we're used to the idea that, okay, well, as part of that, I could name the application and I'll have a certain policy for that application. But then I end up with lots and lots of these different policies that are very hard to maintain. But fundamentally, most of the time what ends up happening is, well, I have certain types of requirement in my organization. Now, every organization is different. You'll have different policy sets of requirements, but you'll probably end up with a set of, well, these types of apps should have this applied. These types of apps, well, they require a phishing resistant MFA. These types of apps, hey, it should be a hybrid Azure AD joined and they should have a low risk. You'll come up with these different sets of requirements for the different sets of sensitivity or classification of your applications. And I don't want to end up having to create all these policies for every single app. It's very, very cumbersome. So another thing we can do in our Azure AD is I can have this concept of creating custom security attributes. So in my Azure AD, custom security attributes. And the way we do this is we create a custom attribute set. So let's say I create a set called application attributes, which is not what I called it, but it doesn't matter. And then within that, I have a certain attribute or set of attributes. So I'm going to just call this my policy requirement. And I might have a set of different policies. So I might have one of them that maybe says no guests. So I can't have any external accounts. I might have one of them that just says MFA is required. I might have another one that says, well, actually, I need a strong authentication and low risk. I might have another one that is phishing resistant and a SAW before you're allowed to access it. So I can define these attributes. And let's obviously take a look at this. So over here, if I go back, let's come out of this. If I go back to my tenant, so here I'm looking at my custom security attributes. Now this is in preview at time of recording under Azure AD. You could create any attribute set you wanted, but I've created one called application attributes. Within there, I just defined one attribute, policy requirement. But you can add as many as you want. Notice I can have Boolean, integer, strings if I wanted to. I can have it so it could just be any value, or you go and add predefined values, which is exactly what I've done. So if we go and look at my attribute, it's this policy requirement. I'm only allowing predefined values, and I've got 4. Now I was messing around with my naming initially, but I've got this idea of no guests, MFA required, strong MFA and low risk, and then phishing resistant and SAW required. So I have 4 different values that can be used for this custom attribute. So that exists. So now what I want to be able to do is drive everything else from those 4 attributes. I don't want to think about having to name applications or anything as part of the conditional access policies I'm going to create. So instead, what we now have is under conditional access, we're going to go ahead and just create policies based around those attribute values. So over here in my conditional access, I'm just going to go and, hey, policy 1, Policy 1, let's say, is going to base it on that policy requirement value, and maybe it's this first one, no guest. So it would have a set, and I'll show you these, would have checks on the user type. Then it would have a deny. Policy 2, and you get the idea of where I'm going with this. Well, this will be based on a value of MFA required, and would drive an authentication strength to allow access if it's that attribute. Hey, policy 3. And the only reason I'm going to show policy 3, so policy 3 is this strong auth and low risk. So this would require strong authentication, but also what we'll do here is this idea of, well, a policy 3 deny. She's going to use that same attribute, but when I start to do things like, hey, if it's not low risk, I want to deny, or it's not a SOAR, I want to deny, I'll normally break that deny into a different policy just because of the way conditional access works. And that's going to make a lot more sense if we just show it. So if we jump over, and let's take a look at all of these. So if I go back into my Entra portal, and in my Entra portal, we could look at the first one. So here down the bottom, so you can see I've got, I think, 6 policies defined for my four regular values, and I've got 2 for deny. So the no guess one, very easy to understand. Specific users are included. Hey, it's guess, so B2B collaborations. Even if they're a member, I don't care. Basically, it's external. And then for the application, we do selected apps, we do configure, and in the configure, we specify the attribute, so that policy requirement, and its value is no guests. And the way you use this, if I just do an add expression, it shows you all of the attribute sets you have. So I would just say, hey, look, it's my application attribute set, and then the attribute policy requirement. You select it, and then you put the value, and then you would type it in. So they're super easy to do. So for my no guests, well, my grant action is to just block it. I'm going to deny you. So that one's super easy. MFA required is also very easy. It targets all users. This time, as you would expect, the filter now says the policy requirement value is MFA required. And then all I do in the grant is I require an authentication strength that's just that basic, hey, I want multi-factor authentication. So far, easy. Now, where I want strong MFA and low risk, once again, it's all users, and I configure it now to be the strong MFA and low risk required, as expected. And the grant, the authentication strength now is my custom one that doesn't allow text or voice. But notice I'm not actually checking the health, the user risk, or the sign-in risk. The reason for this is if I implemented this by in here saying, well, the user risk has to be low and the sign-in risk has to be low or no risk, if I was a high-risk user, well, this policy wouldn't apply, which means it wouldn't enforce the MFA requirement. And so if I want to deny, if I don't meet those requirements, I put the criteria I want for the grant, i.e., hey, I want the stronger authentication when you're this type of application. But if you have that higher risk, the way I do that is a different policy. Again, it's the same filter, but it's actually 2 of mine. It's the strong MFA, or if you're the phishing resistant. So if you are either of those and your user risk is high or medium, or the sign-in risk is high or medium, I'm just going to block you. And so I'm separating those 2 things out, because otherwise, hopefully that makes sense. If I simply had the policy that, hey, your sign-in risk has to be low, your user risk has to be low, and then you require the heightened authentication. If I was going in with a medium or high risk, well, the policy wouldn't match. So maybe then it wouldn't enforce anything. So the way I do those deny actions is, hey, I'll have a different policy to say, hey, you're high risk. I'm just going to block you for that particular classification of applications. That's why it's done that way. I do the same thing for this SOAR requirement. So for the SOAR requirement, once again, we have the filter of now I require the phishing resistant and SOAR. And in the requirements, well, I do a couple of things here. I want the phishing resistant MFA, and I require the device to be marked as compliant, so it's healthy. But once again, I am not checking the device in here. I'm not saying, hey, it has to equal SOAR, because if the device didn't equal SOAR, this policy wouldn't apply, which breaks everything I'm trying to do. So instead, we have another policy which has the same value, hey, phishing resistant and SOAR required. And what we do in this one is our condition is it includes everything unless you are on a SOAR. So it's excluding these particular devices. So if your device is a SOAR device, this policy would not apply. So this policy is saying, hey, it applies to everything that's not a SOAR, and it's trying to access an application that requires a SOAR, and it just blocks access. But obviously, if it is a SOAR, then it would not get denied, and it would go then to the next policy that requires that extra strong phishing resistant MFA. So that's how we have those policies. So now we have this complete set of policies that are going to enforce all of these different requirements. And then the next bit is easy. Now I just set it on application. So if I think about my applications over here, and let's just pick one application. I have an app called Doggos. I have a few apps called Doggos. I set one of these values on my application. So hey, maybe it's MFA required. I set that value as an attribute on the application, which will now enforce it. And the great thing is, hey, maybe that application changes, there's some new heightened set of sensitivity data there. I can just change that attribute, and within, takes about a minute it seems, it will now enforce the new set of conditional access based around that application's configured policy. And that will now drive everything that we do. Let's see that. So what we're going to do, if we jump over, I do have, so we've got those 4 different options. And if I go and look at my enterprise applications over here, and we'll search for our Doggo application, so Doggo's IIS. And again, this applies to anything. So all of these applications I have here, remember, I've got applications in the gallery, thousands of them. You can create your own, which could be something that's just not in the gallery. It could be something I'm writing. It could be something via Azure AD App Proxy. So on-prem, cloud, you name it, this is going to work. But what I've done here is if we look, we have this concept of I can define custom security attributes on my app. So I've gone ahead and I've set that application attribute set and the policy requirement attribute. Now I've got it set right now to MFA as required. So any form of MFA will do. Fantastic. So now if I go to my apps as the user and I access the app, so notice it's making me do an MFA. But if I say, hey, I can't get to my Authenticator app right now, look at all the options it gives me. Because all I did is require MFA. Hey, I can use the Authenticator app, I could text, I could call. I have all these options available. Okay, let's change the app to now require strong MFA. So all I'm doing is changing that policy attribute. Now this does seem to take about a minute. Obviously Azure AD is this big global service and it has to replicate around. So what it's now doing is, hey, John's changed that attribute, synchronizing to all the different things so that when I come back within that minute, what we should see is the requirements have now changed. So let's go back. I may have done this too quick. If not, editing will solve this particular problem. But now if I try and access the exact same app again, I've done nothing different. Let's click the app again. Once again, it's saying, hey, John, you have to approve it. Once again, I'm going to say I can't use the Authenticator app, but look what's happened. I don't have the SMS. I don't have the call options. All it's letting me do now is, hey, I could use a certificate or I could use the Authenticator app because it's got a different authentication strength defined in the policy that now gets applied because I changed the value of the app. What if I say I require a SOAR? Now, the machine I'm currently on is not a SOAR device. It doesn't have that attribute set. And so remember what we have going on right now is those multiple policies, but what should happen first is the deny. So this phishing resistant SOAR is looking for an attribute of SOAR. And only devices that have that are excluded from the policy that is applied, remember, to this type, and it's just going to block access. So what I would actually expect to happen is it won't even ask me about a strong authentication. Let's click it and see what happens. I don't even get access. I'm just denied because I'm not even on a SOAR device. It's not going to let me through. And now obviously I could go back again. I could go and change my Doggo app and I could just put it back to, hey, you just require regular MFA and hit save. And again, 30 to 60 seconds, it would take effect and it would then revert back and just want me to do some authentication. But you see how powerful that is. And all I would do is I would obviously just go through every app. So, hey, this other application, ooh, what's its sensitivity? Okay, well, this one just requires strong MFA. So I've got that configured. So there will be an initial set of work to go and set the attribute, and I could script this. There's different ways of solving this problem. Every app would just be assigned, and now I just have this very core set of conditional access policies. And if my corporate requirements change about what it means to have that particular requirement set, I just update it in one place and it applies to every app that has been essentially categorized with that set of requirements. So now if I go back to Doggo's IIS again, yep, I'm back to those set. So hopefully you see just how powerful, it's a game changer. I move away from the idea of having to create policies per app to instead I create a set of policies for what are my organization's sets of requirements for different classifications of applications, or maybe the data sensitivity it has. So I create an attribute for all the ones I have, and I could add additional ones in the future. I create conditional access policies. And remember, if it's something like, hey, I want you to have a low risk, or I want you to be a SOAR device, the best way to enforce that is I can't just make the positive policy say, hey, you need an attribute of SOAR, because if I don't have that SOAR device, the policy just won't apply to me. So think about splitting those into two. Hey, what are the requirements I have in terms of the authentication, healthy device? And then, hey, if you're not a SOAR, as a deny policy, I'm just going to block you. Hey, if you're a high or medium risk, I'm just going to block you for that attribute definition. So sometimes it might be two policies for each of the classifications. One that is the enforcement of what I need when I am using that. And then others, hey, if you don't meet these sets of requirements, like the device attribute, the risk, I'm just going to block you completely. So those might work together. And then I just go and set an attribute on the applications. Now, maybe in more complicated environments, you might have different sets of requirements. Well, I can just have two attributes that I define on this to apply it that way. But it's going to completely change the way you think about organizing all of those different things. And again, I can just go and update the policies. I can update the tag on the application, and it will just update everything. So I hope that was useful. Again, it is actually very simple at the end of the day, and it completely would be a game changer for how I do my policies. Until next video, take care.